follow your lead. So I'm down with whatever you need to do.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, Tom, thanks for being here. I've known you for a few years now, and it's been a real pleasure to know you, to pick your brain, learn from you. And I want to get into some of the ways that you helped me. But first, let me ask you a really big question. I don't know if you can answer it, but you'd be the guy to ask. So what is Westside Barbell?
Steve, pleasure to be on. Pleasure to know you. And thank you for asking me the hardest question of all time to start with. Westside Barbell is many things to many people, but to me, it's a representation of a training culture that emphasizes a system of training, namely the conjugate method. And then the gym and the name has been created by generations of members between powerlifters and different athletes that kind of have worked in this living laboratory that Louie has created to enhance the methods of training and enhance the environment and culture that we produce. So I don't think you can go Westside Barbell equals something, but to me it's a representation of a lot of different aspects. It's not just one thing that makes it special, it's a lot.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I remember I first learned about it years ago, seeing that you guys have some incredible amount of world records there. It was when I first saw people squatting, benching well over 1,000 pounds, which is just an unbelievable thing. But then I didn't know that you guys also train a lot of other sports athletes. So let me, I guess, ask how you kind of got started there, and do you? So now I know you mostly work with other sports athletes, but how did that all kind of come to be?
Well, I was similar to you. I knew about Westside from the very limited amounts of information that Louie put out, and from the Book of Methods, of course. So when I came here, it was initially for 2 weeks as an internship, and obviously I saw these monsters of people, and then you have people like Laura Phelps, like everyone from the females to the males were just absolute studs of lifters, and it blew my mind. Then when they finished training, more people showed up, and I'm like, who are these people? Like, they don't look like powerlifters. And then I figured out we have NFL, NBA, baseball, track and field, all these different genres of athletes are coming in, and then all these coaches. And I never really read about this. There's a few articles Louie put up, but I didn't know how immersed he was in training other aspects of it. And MMA was a big part, and fighters, like, he loves fighting, and that was one of the kind of things we clicked on, just watching fights together and breaking them down. So that immediately attracted me to, I want to learn as much from Louie, because there's clearly, we're scraping the surface on what he's given out. And just watching him think and break down stuff was just enthralling. So from that, I helped him with some stuff in the business, and kind of our relationship grew. I was definitely not here for my strength levels. That was clearly showed in the first week. But I did like to break down stuff, and I think for some things I acted like a sounding wall for Lou. Didn't have to say much. He just needed someone in the room to throw ideas at, and I learned a lot from there. So 2 weeks turned into 6 months, and 6 months turned into 12 years. So just like you said, I didn't know much about the athlete demographic, and I kind of made it one of my little quests here to try push out as much information about that as we could.
Yeah, I think you've done a great job, and I'm sure you're getting that feedback. I first started by reading the Book of Methods, because I watched some videos, saw what I could, and started reading through that. And it was a little bit difficult to digest, but what I took from it really, really helped. I started putting bands on, I just fell in love with accommodating resistance, the idea of it, and the way it felt on my body when I started using it. And my former training partner and I, we got into some very strange variations, trying all kinds of stuff, because that seems like it's kind of part of your nature there, to try things, to push the limits. Is that right?
It is, and the idea of the gym was to push the limits in the gym so others didn't have to, and we'd only write about what worked. Like, I wasn't there for the biggest experiments and stuff that didn't work, but I saw little bits of stuff we tried, and we take it to the extreme so we could dial it back to give the parameters, kind of like what Preparedness chart did to give you optimal ranges. And Louie really pioneered the accessory work in terms of, just because it's done this way doesn't mean you can't experiment, and don't be afraid to look like a fool. So we would do stuff that no one would think of, like, how can we do this so many ways, what works, what doesn't, write about what works, and then eliminate what doesn't. That in itself was a huge part. And the book of methods, it took me a long time to get my head around it. Not the terms of the content, but the pure chaos of the way that book is laid out. And I'm like, why do we not just get it, refine it? Now, there is some editing stuff in it that we can do better on. But getting to know Louie and getting to know Westside, I don't think you could have it any other way. It's just a representation of how Louie thinks, talks. Everything is connected, and it's so hard to go in a linear fashion, which in itself, the book is against linear periodization because nothing in it is like ABC. But it took me a while to understand like that. That's one of the true gems of how Louie presented information. But yeah. Yeah,
for sure. I know when I then also started trying things and testing it out for myself, I heard Louie at one point, and if people who are watching this don't know who Louie Simmons is, they really need to, look into that and they'll learn a lot. But I heard him a few times ask, how tall is a pyramid? And of course, the answer is that the height of the pyramid is equal to the width of its base. And that gave me a really good framework for how I should structure my training, and that I want to have as wide of a base as I can to give me a stable platform to then build up really high. So when you then start working with other sport athletes, how do you incorporate that? What's your kind of plan of attack to get them the wide base and to help them build up in their sport?
Well, what I did was, and what I recommend everyone does, is I took everything I could learn from Louie at that given point, and obviously you never stop learning, and then all my other experiences, kind of try to mash them together to stay true to the system, but to make it my own, because it has to be something that you're comfortable with. You can't replicate anybody, and you sure as hell can't replicate Louie Simmons. Like, that's not going to happen. So basing on that fundamental of the pyramid analogy you gave was, let's make this athlete a better person in terms of internal structure and external structure. And thankfully, when I came here, I made he's one of my best friends now, is John Quint, and I mentored under him in terms of how to view a joint and how it works in relation to ligaments and tendons, and then how that works to muscles and how they interact with each other. So if we got someone better from the inside out, so just check their joint capacities, checked all these things, it made general training way easier. And it made my job as a strength coach a lot more optimal. And not to dumb it down, but it was like join the dots. I couldn't miss because I was asking all the right questions. And we would train so general at the start that athletes were getting immensely better physically. So when they went back to do their skill, they had a lot more room for more skill acquisition. But where it gets in the nitty gritty is that transition period, right? And the stuff that we've talked about is you can train generally for a certain amount of time, but then we have to move up the rung of the ladder or up the steps of a pyramid. So the entry level is fun, easy, in terms of we're just accumulating data. Nothing is subjective. It's all objective. I'm giving you data, you're giving me data, and we're figuring out what is right, what is wrong. Then as you go up, well, we can't just make you a better athlete in general. You have to be good for your sport. And that's where transfer of training comes in. And like Bondarchuk and a lot of coaches talk about this, but there is that transition period, and it's different for each athlete, and as sure as hell is different for each sport, especially golf. Especially when you have an implement that is outside of your body, there's a lot more variables at play, and that's something that has always been refined on. So we have a really good level of GPP, understanding of how to do that. And where I think Louie excelled at was taking this system, enhancing it through his research with his athletes, and then understanding how to transfer it into a given sport, while keeping in this culture of, like, it's a big thing to train Westside outside of Westside, but when you're in the gym, here there's something in the walls, there's something in the culture that hammers home everything you're doing is for a bigger purpose. And like, no one pays to train here. That's you give back through your effort, and that's your payment. And then obviously we take the education from it.
Excuse me for a second. I want to tell you real quick about my favorite training aid and a sponsor of the podcast, the Lag Shot. It's designed with what they call lag flex technology that'll help you to create and maintain more lag in your swing, which will give you better consistency and more speed, which we all want, right? But my favorite part is that you can go out and actually hit balls with it. It's a real club. They make a driver, a 7-iron, and a wedge. So you can incorporate it into your practice sessions to ingrain the better technique that it's teaching you. Once you try it, you'll see why I love it. Go to lagshotgolf.com/crush or click the link in the description below to get 15% off. lagshotgolf.com/crush.
But to come back is that I would take the system that he laid out. What I learned from his is like, okay, how do we take the fundamentals that we need to build up from assessment, take the information from John. We've made you generally a better person, athlete. Now, how do we transfer it into your sport? And that's where it can go really quickly or really slowly, depending on the amount of athletes come in. So like for you, when we working together, we get from A to C really quickly, from C to D takes a long time because we don't have that data coming in all the time. So you try to reach out and talk, but golf, it's its own unique entity in terms of the difference of coaching opinions and how stuff is done. But I may have digressed, which I'll do a lot in this conversation. But that's what I tried to bring in all the different aspects. And the one thing with Westside and the conjugate method, its style of it is it's a way to train. It's not the way, it's our way. We think it's the best because it's the best for us. But if someone else can improve upon it, like 100% we're going to jump and look at what they're doing and try put it in. When you start getting into absolutes, you're kind of limiting yourself to progression of strength and conditioning. And strength and conditioning itself is a relatively new term and occupation. It's really been in place since the mid-'70s between Terry Todd, Boyd Epley, everyone bringing it to the forefront. It's still going through its iterations of who's right, who's wrong, how should we do this. And I think if you take all that together, it keeps coming back down to the same things. Keep it simple, keep it objective, and be consistent.
And one of the good parts of the conjugate method is that you guys have built in the allowance for change over time, where you see some plans that are, here you do 5 sets of 5, and like that's what you do for that block, and it never changes, right? But you guys, when I was reading the book of methods, it would say, I don't remember the exact examples, but maybe 10 sets of 2 at 75% or 50 plus 25. For people who are familiar with the conjugate method, they'll know what I mean. And then I was watching a YouTube video of Louie, and he's like, no, it's 10 sets of 3, and slightly different variations that over time you guys learn. And I would hear other people like Dave Tate say, I haven't been there in however long, so things have changed since then, but this is what we used to do. And it's cool that you guys are so objective with it, and you're so good at gathering that data and testing what works, and then you are willing to implement the change. There's too many people that get stuck with their old ways, right? Yeah,
and our feedback loop is so fast. It's 7-day period. So every week we both know your strengths, where we need to work on, where your GPP or where your conditioning level is, how is it transferring over to your sport. So we're getting all this data in real time. We're not waiting to go through this block of training, because that's where stuff goes wrong. And looking from the inside out, we know where your joint capacities are. We know when we have comparable data of the good thing with John and working with the FR and FRC teams are that we have dedicated ranges of motion that are standard. So we have some standardized objective data to compare to. So until you get there, we know there's room for improvement. But it's just being able to give you, the athlete, here, you can take as much or as little as you want. And that goes, some athletes don't want to know a thing. They just want to get in, get out, and go do their sport. Other people want some data like, well, hey, how can I get to be the best? And the higher the competency level of the athlete, the more data you need to make little changes. So you might train all year to get a tiny, tiny improvement. But when you're getting up towards that ceiling, like those little changes make a huge, huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, there are kind of objective minimums that you need to get to. And it can be a little bit tricky because we've seen, and you and I were talking about this the other day, but we see a lot of golf training that addresses the kind of like quick, fun things. You're maybe stretching here in a different way, or you're throwing a ball in a different way. But that's kind of toward the top. To go back to the pyramid analogy, that's kind of toward the top in a lot of cases. the quick fix is usually not the long fix or the right fix. So a lot of the stuff that you would program for me or for other golfers is that they need to be putting in the work for a little while, and they need to get that wider base before they kind of jump up and start doing some of those things. But it's not as exciting, right? It's not as easy to advertise, hey, you're going to go in and you're going to, struggle with this max effort workout. Like, just buckle up.
It's like what you're saying is correct. Everyone has a purpose in training, right? You have a big toolbox. Everyone brings their discipline or their tool to help you be better. We're masters of putting in foundations. And I don't care how good your house is, how big it is, how it looks, with a shitty foundation, it's going to fall over. So we're masters of putting in that ground level. And then as the hierarchy changes, we're very adaptable to work with other coaches, work with athletes, give objective analysis. We're not there to criticize. We're not there to talk down to other coaches. We're there to work because we understand we're a cog in the machine of an athlete's training. And the hierarchies will change over time. And as I said, every 7 days we have this feedback coming in. Golf presented very unique challenges in that there are so many people involved that on the outside didn't necessarily know, from scheduling to events to traveling to swing coaches to sports psychologists. You have all these different variables in, and there's no really head coach. Sometimes there is, but they don't know all the different aspects, and they have their own internal hierarchy that's subjective, not objective. So, and there's, and I might be completely wrong, but there's like 5 or 6 big players in the training space that we can see, and they focus on really important aspects, but no one kind of brings it all together. There's one bit that's more important than the other, and that's true in a hierarchy, but it has to change. You can't keep, this is always the number one thing. There's no such thing. You have to adapt to your game, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where I see that there's openings. And coming back to what we do is we'll give you a solid foundation. It's not going to be sexy. It's not going to be anything that really is like, wow, we have all these computers hooked up to us. No, it's so fundamental, but that's what people need. And I think the further everything progresses, they get away from the fundamentals, and that's how you build your base, and that's how you become the best athlete possible.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to let anybody misconstrue that as to think that you guys were low tech or whatever, because you're not. You use everything that anybody could want to benefit. It's just that you recognize the values of those fundamentals and the accumulated progress over a period of time, which is incredibly important. But like you were saying, it really depends on the person. I've had so many people ask me at clinics and whatever else, what's the best exercise for golf? What's the best exercise to hit it farther? And it's a difficult question because there's not one answer, and it's a disappointing answer to say, oh well, it depends on you. But it's totally true, right? You have to know how the person is right now, where they're trying to go, and the answers could be totally different. So how do you go about kind of assessing that?
Those 2 words, it depends, drives people insane. But you can generalize and you can give like just rules of thumb, which we try to do, but it's all context dependent. Everyone is different. There's some common things we see amongst athletes, but everyone presents a unique set of challenges, which is awesome because true strength conditioning is problem solving. And that's, the more variables you have, the more problems are to solve, and it becomes really, really interesting. But when we go back to the assessment, that right there is going to tell me what you need physically, and I'll show you what you need physically. And when we get, the idea of creating that training program is to give you the best possible advantage for skill acquisition. I'm not going to make you a better golfer. I have no idea how to make you a better golfer. And if strength was the be all end all for the long drive, like, we should have world champions in Westside Barbell, right? Like, there's a whole different skill component here too. So there's a certain level, there's a prerequisite of strength you need. And then we've talked about this. Then there's that conversion phase. We can give you the best possible chance. It's up to you. It's like we're a master mechanic. We're giving you a supercar. You have to learn how to drive it. We can't teach you that, but we can give you the best option. That's the way I see it. So when people ask me, well, how can I increase my club head speed? How can I drive the ball further? I'm like, give me a week and let's go through all these things. Like, I can't just say, hey, do this, but like, are you pulling sleds? No, that could be it. Do you lift max? Do you do max effort? No, that could be it. Do you do the dynamic effort? That could be it. Have you tested your internal and external capacities in your hip joint? No, that could. There's so many things that could be it. And again, this is going to drive more people insane. We can answer all the questions correctly. We can make you a stud athlete in the gym. Now you got to put it into your sport. And the stronger you get and the more range of motion you get could completely change how you swing. And then now you have to transfer that into your sport, and that could take you instantaneous or it could take you a year. You don't know. So it's finding that happy balance of acquiring more strength, range of motion, being a better athlete that transfers into your sport without a big change. Mm-hmm. We have this with sprinters, that we increase their strength level so much that it disrupts their start. So they have to practice their start while they're working with us. That way they understand how the force is distributed and how they jump out the blocks. And it's the same that we, it's a puzzle and everyone's different, but if you can get that right, then that's going to give you the best possible way to, when you're playing, just say 18 holes of golf, strength, maximum strength plays one aspect, but you need endurance. Because in a book called The Game Changer by an author called Fergus Connolly, he talks about Tom Brady. You need enough reserve for mental capacity to make correct decisions. So that could be another thing that might help your game, might help your distance, because you have enough brain power left because you're not worried about being out of breath, walking up a hill, walking 11 miles, whatever is happening. You have enough capacity to hit that ball as similar as possible every time. So there's so many variables, and again, I keep going back down to it really does depend. There's no one thing that I can say for sure this is going to increase your drive.
I've never considered that. That was interesting. That if you're out of breath or whatever, you're not going to be able to. Well, you're probably not going to be as predisposed to hitting a good normal shot as if you were. And of course, long drive is a little different because you're going faster. You want to kind of have your heart rate up higher. You want to be in the heat of the competition there versus tournament golf where you're kind of more steady for 5 hours or whatever it is. But you also mentioned the increased range of motion in the joints, and that's a really interesting thing because I've seen that with clients that I've worked with, and I've experienced it myself, where let's say you're used to turning your hips 30 degrees, and you're doing different mobility work, you're doing all different kinds of things, strengthening those ranges of motion, and then you can turn 45 degrees. That extra 15 degrees, you're going to feel kind of lost. It's like if you're used to turning the steering wheel of a car, here and here, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, over there, it gets wild. So that acquisition phase, or I forget the term you use, but where you're learning how to use that better physical capacity can be a frustrating thing for athletes.
And that's why it's so important to do things in tandem. When you have seasons in sport, you can't afford to drop it. So if we work with football players, with sprinters, with fighters, they're still going to be doing stuff that's sports specific that we know that they're carrying it over, right? So they can give us feedback from what they're feeling. And especially with coaches, been able to talk to some swing coaches, like their feedback is invaluable when they're willing to work with us. A lot of the times, they don't want to work with, like, what do you know about a golf? Exactly, teach me. The more you can teach me, the better it's going to be, so I can give you accurate data. Or I can tell you, hey, there's more range of motion here. And they might go, okay, well, how do we do this in a slower progression? Depending where you are in the season, right? We don't want to completely screw you up mid-season. It makes no sense. We want to make sure you're not going to get injured so we can work when you get done and use that time to really hone in and develop. And that's where, for individual sports, it's based around a team. Like, you can do a certain amount yourself, but eventually you're going to need someone to bounce ideas off to go, hey, am I on the right track? And that's where, like, talking and having this little feedback system, the more people give into it, the better data that you can make. At the end of the day, it's you who's out there, and our job is, like, we're giving you the best possible advantage to be the best athlete on the worst day possible. That's what we want. So if you're having a terrible day, you know that you have the reserve to crush it, because it's easy to be the best on your best day, right? It happens. You're in the zone, like you're right there. But how can you do that on the worst day possible? And that's what we're trying to prepare things and avoid injury.
That's an important thing to consider. And absolutely, I've never been really high up in other sports, but in golf, yeah, when you're having an on day, it's the easiest thing in the world. The ball is going incredibly far. If it's in long drive, it's going where you want it. On the course, you're just making putts. But the off days, that's where it really tests you. And like you're saying, you want to build up that reservoir or the physical capacity to handle those days, and the mental capacity for sure. So one thing I've been thinking about, this is kind of changing topics a little bit, but for powerlifting, you're obviously going to use squat, bench, and deadlift because that's your sport. So you're going to use variations of those and whatnot to increase your capacity there. If you're working with a sprinter, you're going to also use those same lifts and probably some sprinting. An MMA fighter, you'll probably use all of that. A golfer will use all of that. But you'll never really see it go the other way, where like a powerlifter would use a golf swing or hitting golf balls to increase their capacity. So how do you factor that in when you're looking at, okay, there's this really specific movement that this sport requires, and there's no overlap? Because there's a lot of overlap with different accessory exercises and whatnot, but nobody else is really swinging a golf club.
So I'm trying to get to the meat of this question.
So I guess maybe distinguishing between like GPP and SPP. So for people who don't know, the general physical preparedness versus specialized for your sport, there's a lot of overlap, the way I see it, where you do have pretty much every sport nowadays, I hope, is using a lot of powerlifting moves to get better at their sport.
Yep.
But it doesn't work the other way. So you don't have, like, so if you have a really specialized move like a golf swing, they'll use the other ones, but the other sports will not use something like a golf swing to get better.
I get what you're saying. That's a very unique question, but you do bring in a good point in that the squat, bench, and deadlift are the squat, bench, and deadlift. They happen to be the sport of powerlifters, but they are exercises. And the playing golf recreationally for a powerlifter may be phenomenal. Like, there are powerlifters who go out and play golf. They love it. It's great for their mental clearance. Like, if they're good, they can enjoy it more so than if you're not so good. But in terms of transfer of training, it's not a physical weight. It's more of a recreation. It could be something that could be seen as active recovery, more so because that's not their sport. And this is a thing that people do forget, is when you're a powerlifter, when you're in the gym, that's your arena. That's your golf course. That's your ring. Because on the platform, you're using pretty much the similar setup, right? So you're getting your SPP, your GPP all in one. It's a unique factor of that sport, similar to Olympic weightlifting. So not all other sports will carry over. That's the unique factor of it. I'm sure there's a more efficient way to articulate the differences, but to me, I would see stuff, because people do play golf recreationally, and for some powerlifters, that might be active recovery, where they go out and it de-stresses them, it works them out to a level that helps them with their recovery. But the other way around is that you have to see squat, bench, and deadlift. They're exercises at the end of the day. That's the big thing. They're part of what we do, but they're not the sport. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does for sure. I remember that I've heard you told me, and I've seen it in videos, where for a powerlifter, like you're saying, that's their arena. But for a golfer or for another athlete, we're not training to get better in the gym. That's a byproduct. We're using the gym to get better at our sport. And really drawing that line is really important, because I know I've certainly been caught up in it where, like, I need to hit a certain deadlift or bench or whatever it may be, thinking that exclusively is going to carry over to my sport. But there's those layers like we've talked about, and you have to have it carry over. So how do you draw that line? Because I'm sure you get a lot of people. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's like, all right, if I get a 10-pound PR, I'm going to go then set a PR out on the golf course right away.
No, like you're not the only person who says this. I was lucky in that I'm not a powerlifter. So I could see how powerlifters would train. I could see how athletes would train. And then I could also see how someone who is a powerlifter would train an athlete like a powerlifter. And for some sports, it has great carryover. Like a football lineman, huge similarities. Shot putter, huge similarities. Golf, not so much, right? There's not a huge similarity. We'll use bench squat, deadlift, and accessory work to get better as an athlete in general, but there's not that direct correlation. So you might get a 10-pound PR in a squat, and that psychologically makes you go out and be a better golfer. That could happen for sure. And again, back to the word, it depends. But like, I can assure you that just doing that is not going to make you the best golfer in the world. And whatever sport you're in, if you're a professional athlete, your aspirations is to be number one, right? That's why you're in it. You're a competitive person. And to be number one usually means you are very well-rounded and have some sort of advantage over the others. So you may have a very good accuracy level, and that's your thing, and then you're building up everything around it. So the more well-rounded you can become, and to give an advantage to your discipline, the better it is. And the best analogy I can think of is that some of the best grapplers in the world don't just do jiu-jitsu. They do wrestling, judo, sambo. They do everything around it to be the best jiu-jitsu player. So if I was a golfer, I'd be doing everything around it that could make me the most well-rounded golfer. And to me, that's your body, making your body as strong as necessary, not as possible, because there is a cutoff. You don't need to squat 1,000 pounds to be number one in the world. But there is a level, there is a minimum requirement you need. That will differ from person to person. But if you can hit those minimum requirements and train as often as necessary, not as often as possible, and I think that comes from Hank Krakanoff, that was his saying, then you're giving yourself the best possible advantage to be the best in the world. That's the best way I can try articulate. Mm-hmm. I would love, if I could invent that one exercise that could equal you being the best in the world, like this would be a whole different conversation. I'd be calling you from my friggin' house in Barbados drinking on the beach, but that's not going to happen. It doesn't exist.
Well, one of the first things that piqued my interest about the conjugate method was your dynamic days, because I was looking and I saw strong athletes. Like I was training in a powerlifting gym when I lived in Illinois, and they had some like world-class powerlifters there, but they would follow a very, squat, bench, deadlift kind of routine. And just kind of conceptually, I was like, well, okay, that's great. That's their sport. They're really good at it. Is that going to make me faster? Is it going to make me a better athlete? I don't know. And I saw the dynamic method. I was like, oh, you're going for max speed. That's really cool. Let's learn more about that. So how did you get started? Or how did Louie, how did you guys incorporate that?
Well, that came from trial and error and a lot of from the Soviet manuals. But I think the Science of Practice of Strength Training has an example in it with shot putters, that as their strength level went up, their shots went up. So then they did more max effort. And then the shots, the distance stalled and went backwards. So as they got stronger, they got slower. So they figured out, hey, we need to do some speed work here. So then that's where speed came in to get a fast rate of force development. So being able to train sub-maximally at different speeds had carryover to the maximal strength, or had carryover to the given sport. And Louie really dialed this in more than most, because he experimented at different percentages to what's the type of strength you need to work at. Is it explosive strength? Is it strength speed strength? Is it static? Is it static or isometric? There's quasi-isometric. What is your sports discipline? What does it require? What do you lack? And then dynamic effort day, to me, it's the most important days there are. Because one, volume, density, recruitment, everything is happening in that one training session. The dynamic effort lower for every sport is the most important. Like without that day, because that day can be done all year round, in season, out of season, doesn't matter. That can stay in there. It can help maintain or build upon gains you've got so you don't go backwards. You can rotate in and out accessory work as necessary. So dynamic effort is huge. And it can replace max effort during in season. So you never I said, go backwards. You're always moving forward. You're always keeping on to the gains you got. So when you start back again, it's like a little staircase. You're in season. We're maintaining. Possibly we have opportunities to get better. And then when you come out of season, we're building up again, and off you go. So dynamic effort has been a huge part. As you said, you can be doing speed strength, explosive strength. All you got to do is adjust percentages. Mm-hmm. And it's there in books. And a lot of it comes from Preparedness chart, who did studies over thousands of athletes and got the optimal ranges for given strengths. Then the other stuff is hammered home in the Science of Practice of Strength Training by Zatsiorski. So this is where all this came from. And Louie never said he invented it, but he was smart enough to use it and smart enough to enhance it. That's what he didn't. He took it and it's like, hey, how can I improve upon this with my athletes? And that's what he pioneered. He didn't come up with it, and he said it multiple times. I think what he said was he didn't invent toilet paper, but he was smart enough to use it. But that's where all this comes from. But back to dynamic effort, that to me is it is the most important aspect of training, because you get so much data from it too. Do
you change the weights and or the accommodating resistance depending on the sport that the athlete is competing in?
It's all based off percentages. We might change the weights to match the given strength they need. So explosive strength will be less weight. Speed strength will be a little bit more. That's what we usually talk about, the 50, 55, 60% bar weight with 25% band tension. And I want to use this opportunity to say these are rules of thumb. We have people who live and die by, like, how can I get 25%? These are just measures to keep you in the ranges. Like, it will differ. We've had some people, and depending on how tall you are too, it will differ. But these are just guidelines. They're not gospel. They're there to be played with.
Just to interject for a second, that was one fun. So my training partner that I had for a couple of years, and we pushed each other in really fun ways. He was a little bit shorter than me, and he was stronger than me. So that was kind of my advantage there. I felt like it was an advantage. Where every time we would hook up the bands for squat, bench, deadlift, my range of motion was a little bit bigger. So I was like, oh, okay, my band tension's a little higher. I'm working a little bit harder, even if the bar is moving a little slower. I'm putting more force out. So yeah, it's fun. You can mess around with because we would get this little like luggage scale and measure what it is at the top, mm-hmm. and then we would try like what if you double the bands, and what if you have both arms or both sides of it up versus one and just knot it at the bottom. And there's a lot of cool things to try there.
What you brought up there is something that shows you're a pro athlete, because you see things that many other people were like, well, it's not the same. Like, you saw it as an advantage, right? That's what drove Louie nuts. If someone was 7 foot, someone was 4 foot, it's like band tension is all relative. It's the same. And you're like, no. But if you're taller, thinking of it, hey, I got an advantage over them because I'm getting more out of it. Like, that is the appropriate way, the Westside way to look at things. So, I just said I'd call that what I saw it.
Well, I only had the pleasure of training there a few times. But okay, so one story about it. I usually don't, like in anything in life, I don't feel like I have to like prove myself to anyone or perform for anyone other than myself. But I was there. You and I were doing deadlifts. I think it was just like a normal sumo pull, no bands or anything. And Luke Edwards happened to be watching. He was just sitting in there. And for people who don't know who Luke Edwards is, he's got the most like intense stare you'll ever see. His eyes are like like a husky, like ice blue kind of, and his face is just, you can tell he's been through some stuff in his life. He's an intense dude. And so he's sitting like 6 feet in front of me, just staring at me while I'm doing these deadlifts. And we work up to like 400, 450. And at that time I was having some hip pain. So I was trying to, work around the hip pain, and we put on 505 or whatever it was. And I was like, I have to get this lift. He's literally right in front of me, staring right at me. I know what he can lift. This is chump change. And so I go down, and I think I break the ground, but the hip was hurting too much and I just couldn't get it. And I felt like such a wimp just having him stare at me. It was awful. But yeah, it's a really cool environment there.
Luke is to me, he's a mixture of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Woody Harrelson from Natural Born Killers. Like, he has that look, and he has that 1,000-yard stare. Like, Luke is definitely an embodiment of the West Side attitude. and stronger than shit. And I mean, dude, he's a Westside member through and through. But yeah, I can get that. And going back to having that culture is a big thing, to where you hold yourself to a level, but once you step in that door, you're held to extremely high standard, even internally, right? You walk in that door, a lot of people get goosebumps because they know the people who've been there before them, and every time you step in and train at Westside, you're representing everyone who came before you. So you don't have to be the strongest, especially the athletes wise. You don't have to be the strongest. You just have to give your best.
So let me jump back to the dynamic, effort, explosive, strength, speed, strength, all that. So I've always basically done the 50 plus 25, other than the experimenting with different things. What would you then recommend for people who maybe don't have their, Prelipin chart with them? What would you recommend for the explosive strength, people who want to lighter weights move faster?
About 35% bar weight, and around 25% accommodating resistance, because it as you're coming out of the bottom, it's going with your strength curve, unless you're completely back. Like some people do change the natural strength curve, but that's where I would be at. And if you don't have bands, just go to straight weight. But bands everyone has bands nowadays, so they're pretty easily to get access to them, and they're the number one training resource. You can travel with them. You can put them in a backpack. They don't take up a lot of space. Like they're a good asset to have in your arsenal of tools.
So just to be clear, if people, like if you could squat 400 pounds, that would be having the bar weight be roughly 135, and then put another 100 or so
25%.
in band tension. When you're at the top, it's an extra 100 pulling you down, right? Okay.
Yeah, and then as you go down, it's going to shrink by about 10%, about 5 or 10%. So then that way, as you're getting to your biomechanically strongest position, you're pushing to the top.
What would happen if you went with that 30% bar weight, but then went 50 or 60% band tension?
Depending on your strength, bands are not forgiving. You're going to be moving more onto potentially speed strength, or strength speed, like having way more band tension than bar weight. It's all percentage wise, right? Mm-hmm. You only have 100%, but if you do 100% in band tension at the top, it's a whole different feeling, because bands are pulling you down. They're not forgiving. Straight weight feels a lot different at the top than 700 pounds of band tension, and 700 pounds of bar weight feels completely different. Yeah. So these if you have pitch perfect form, an example of that is Laura Phelps. Her form is the gold standard. Dave Hoff's another one who has perfect form. Well, they can get away with more band tension because structurally they're able to keep in that position. But if you don't, bands are not forgiving. And then too, they tax the central nervous system a different way, so there's recovery components you have to bear in mind. And you said if everyone doesn't have access to Prelipin's chart, we all have smartphones. So if you Google it, there's so much stuff out there for free that there's really no excuse anymore. Once you know about it, you can Google it and go for it. Yeah, for sure. Now, you call it accommodating resistance, and I know you've talked about this a lot. It's the opposite of that, right? It gets harder the higher you go. Have you guys experimented with the reverse way, reverse bands, where it will get lighter as you go? We have. So the future method, that's what it's referred to, because you're lifting weights now that you will do in the future. They were really, when I came here, they're at the tail end of using that all the time. So they would rotate it in for days. If they wanted to get a PR for max effort, they would go to this because they knew they could achieve it, because you're using basically less weight to get a PR. But in the real world, it didn't have huge carryover. Now, if you have issues at the top of a lift, it can carry over hugely. If you want to feel weight, like a deadlift, it helps you out the bottom of the top. You're actually holding the weight, similar to a squat. For unracking and stuff like that, it has a purpose. But for athletes, we didn't get huge benefit out of it. To me, it was a great resource to have for athletes who've got stuff going on outside. So mentally, their central nervous system is taxed. A good example is collegiate athletes during exam periods. Right now, the shift to academics is back in. This has huge, I guess, impact on how you are as an athlete in school. So exams stress you out hugely. So by being able to use the future method for them allows them to max out, but doesn't tax the central nervous system or takes into account that's already taxed. So it gives us that variable to put in rather than doing something like standing on a 4-inch box deadlifting, which would completely crush them and would carry over into the exams where they'd be dead. So we're trying to give them a big advantage. That's usually where we use it. But for athletes, it's less than 5% in a yearly rotation, if used at all. It's in your toolbox. It's that one tool that you never use until you need to use it, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I've been doing some more stuff lately, like band-assisted jumping and bunny hops and stuff like that. But I think that's for a different purpose, right? That's to kind of, not like a depth jump, but you're coming down from a higher place. You're just kind of training your body to be that springy. Is that right?
I'm pretty sure springy is the appropriate Latin term for it. But it's contrasting, right? You're adjusting for your body weight. So just like when you got a bar on your back, you're doing 30%. You're doing the same thing. You're trying to get yourself that certain percentage to work on that given strength, whether it's reactive strength, explosive strength. You're getting in the percentage-wise, right? That's what I see, or where my brain goes to when you say that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then let me use that as I guess, a segue into what I told you I wanted to talk about a few days ago, where I went down to this really cool golf gym in North Carolina, and they've worked with a lot of different golfers, do a lot of different tests to kind of standardize what, for a golfer of this either skill level or swing speed level, what are some of the like numbers that they need in terms of like throwing a medicine ball or a certain force output or whatever. And they found that I test really well I move heavy weights really well, but I'm not moving light weights well right now. So what would you suggest for that? And I guess, is that kind of to be expected? Because I think my ratios have been a little bit off in terms of too much heavy and maybe not enough like really sport specific light stuff.
Where my mind goes to when I hear that is that your central nervous system has not been stimulated with light weights because you're so used to lifting heavy, or probably so used to producing results in pressure, that your central nervous system is like, oh, this is not fight or flight. I can get through this. What we touched upon in the start, that transition phase of how are we taking what we're doing in the gym and transferring into the sport. There's back to a car analogy, you shift gears with a clutch, right? Like, what's that clutch to transfer from the gym into your sport? And I think that's where that refinement period comes in. So potentially you've reached the prerequisites to be as strong as you need for golf, to be as fast as you need from golf in terms of the gym aspect. Now we need to get the accessory work where you're able to output maximum force into a light object. This will tell you how uneducated I was when I first worked with golfers when they used weighted clubs. I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. I didn't understand what the difference of a weighted club was. I'm like, possibly you're using a 25-pound club. Like, no. Like, it's not that. It's like little lead strips that go on, those little differences. But if you take that analogy, what are the accessory work that we can do that can help convert your central nervous system to activate maximally when you need it? And it's about knowing your body better and having more access to that. So we know maximally you can access your central nervous system to do amazing things, to lift heavy things, to recruit faster. But now it's the sport, and you need to have a certain series of exercises that help with that transfer into it. And so from my perspective, like, okay, we did a good job on one aspect, but we didn't do a good job in transferring it in. And I said that could take a week, it could take a year. It depends on the amount of data we have going back and forth. So that's where it is with me. We have to figure out exercises that transfer into it better. So when you do a post test with these people, that you have access to your central nervous system to maximally recruit. And I think Louie talked about it, about you can throw a wiffle ball off a window, it won't break. But you throw a rock, it'll go through it. And we're trying to figure out, okay, we want to get a tennis ball. We want it to bounce off that window, but still have force, right? That's where we We have to go in, to me, a selection of the correct weight, the correct exercises, and then everyone's going to be different. But for you, we'll have a list of exercises, we'll trial and error, and then we'll compare what you're doing. So to me, it's back into transfer of exercise into the sport.
Well, that brings up sort of a separate topic, but related to the mass going into the window there. I've talked with a couple people in golf about it, as far as how much of your mass carries over to the impact with the golf ball. And I think a lot of people would say it's basically negligible because smash factors and whatnot, in terms of there's a ratio of the club head speed and the ball speed, that those are relatively consistent. But I do think that there's something to it where I'm not just saying you should go be the biggest golfer you can and that's going to carry over to you hitting it farther, but maybe some difference in technique or difference in raw power output or something can help you to carry over more of your mass. Because I've seen a lot of people that just get a more efficient ball strike. They're hitting like a heavier ball, and it seems like they're putting more of themselves into that collision. Have you thought of, in terms of other sports, like I don't know, baseball or whatever? I don't know. Is that talked about?
It is, and it's talked about by much more intelligent people than myself. So they, like The Rock says, I know my role, but the data that they do and provide gives, like we obviously try to interpret and try aid it as much as we can. But now you're getting really into more of the sports science, in my opinion, than the strength and conditioning aspect. And as a strength coach, I try to know enough to have an intelligent conversation with a sports scientist, knowing that they can go into the nitty gritty really quick and I can be out of my depth. But that would fall more on that line. But when they do all that data, that's what we read. Thankfully, like for journals and articles and what they put out, like, oh, that makes sense. Here's where I think I can aid this. There's so many variables at play that I couldn't give an intelligent input at the start, if that makes sense. Yeah. I would have to read everything that comes out. But I do think that there is a certain factor on a fundamental level is mass moves mass. And there is physics fundamentals that we do utilize. But you're in a sport where there is so much data. Like there's so many different golf coaches, swing coaches out there that have their own unique way of teaching, and I think it's up to you to find the person that clicks with your style of swing. And then, I mean, like you have Tiger Woods, you have John Daly, like you have Brooks Koepka, there's just so many different body types and builds that I think it's up to you to find what works for you. So it goes back down to it depends. But to answer your question is, I'm not smart enough to give you an articulate answer on that.
Well, I don't believe the smart part, but I think that's a really good answer, because anytime you find an expert who will say, I don't know, and we need to know more information, that establishes a really, in my opinion, a lot of credibility and helps you to trust that person more, which is one of the things that stood out to me right away. So let's get into a little bit of the story of how you and I met. So when I was living in Chicago, the Arnold Classic in Columbus, where you guys are, is not too far. So I sent you an email. I saw you guys were offering guest passes to come in and check out the facility. So I sent you an email, or I think I just sent like a general email to Westside. I was like, hey, can I come in? By the way, I'm a golfer. I'd love to talk about whatever. And you wrote me back and you're like, yeah, I've worked with, PGA golfers. I've worked with a lot of other stuff. Let's meet up. And then you were my trainer for a period of time. I don't know how long. And I've been trying to pick your brain
not long enough.
incessantly ever since. And it's really been awesome, because it seemed like everything I would ask you about, you're either like, oh yeah, this book on this page says this, and here's, they answer your question, or you give that legitimate answer. Both are legitimate, but to say, I don't know, we need to look into it more. I guess let me ask then, what's your background? Obviously you've read a lot of sports science books and done a lot of the studying.
My background is in exercise and health studies, and then I got into strength conditioning before it was the occupation, right? Before everyone was, I want to be a strength coach. Back then, if a strength coach was called a personal trainer, like it was a fist fight. There was no. I'm not a PT. Now it's a whole different story. Then I was in a lot of right places at the right time. Then from going through college, specializing in strength and conditioning, I got an opportunity to lecture some night classes, and that developed into more and more roles to where I wanted to educate myself. And then I traveled like a good part of the world. I spent a lot, like, I won't say a lot of time, but I spent a time in Thailand. At that time I was fighting. I was doing a little bit of, I was attempting to fight and do Muay Thai, but I got a huge lesson over there, and that kind of opened up my horizons to a lot of Australian strength coaches who were there. And so I went back, and I'm going back to college, finishing it off. And it's a long, boring story, but I ended up at Westside Barbell. And when I came here, I realized theoretically I had a good understanding of what not to do. Because the real world, you're not prepared for that when you come out of college. You can do internships throughout, but when a pro athlete comes to you and goes, make me better, there is a huge responsibility there that can't be taught, has to be learned. Then seeing how Louie did everything. I learned so much from just watching how he interpreted data. He could store it in his head. I couldn't, so I used Excel sheets. He used his brain power. But anything he didn't know, he would say, I don't know, and he would go research it and look at it so he would never be in that position again. And that's kind of spurred on how he was always reading, always educating himself. But been adaptable and been open to different systems, different thoughts, different books, and just knowing that to find the answer. I think I'm going, what was the initial question? I kind of segued off.
Kind of just how you got into that and your education. So you answered a lot of that.
Okay, and then too, realizing that when you work with an athlete, you are teaching me more than I'm going to teach you. I'm going to try to give you everything I have, but every athlete I work with gives so much valuable data in terms of their personality, what they want in terms of data. I quickly realized get rid of subjective, and Louie hammered this home to me. I think it was one of the Schottensteins or someone would come in and go, show me what you've done. So I always assumed that an athlete would come to me and go, well, show me what I've done. So objective data became number one for me to have that in place. And then always a lifelong student. Like Louie, I can see these are some of the books that he had here. He was always reading, always studying, always trying to refine. And if anything was complex, he would use basically first principles. Like, let's get back to the very start and let's try and make it as simple as possible and evolve from there, because no complex system starts complex. If it starts too complex, it's going to be disastrous. So that was a big thing. And so like I do thank like everything that I learned outside of college and from experiences, Louie helped me refine it into a system that works in real time. That you can't learn that in a classroom. And I've had this debate with a lot of strength coaches in that I feel to be a really good strength coach, it needs to be treated more like a trade than an academic subject. Sports science is a different ballgame altogether. We need to know enough to have a conversation. They need to really hammer home the collegiate aspect because they're developing technologies, data. They're making sure what we're doing is right and they're guiding us. But strength and conditioning needs, like, you need to have weights in your library. Like, it needs to be done. You need to work with athletes. You need to understand the trials and tribulation that come with it. So I got that from Lou, and I'm very thankful for that. I
don't know what kind of better experience and education you could really hope for, to be around the athletes that you've been around. And, you know, then you've also coached a lot of NFL coaches. You've coached a lot of other strength coaches themselves that then try to take your methods and not take, but that use your methods and try to incorporate it into their teams. So you've seen and advised all kinds of stuff, right?
Well, and two, they come back and talk to me. So it's reciprocal when they go out, and again, it's all about sharing information. And I understand everyone needs needs money to live and to do things. It's baffling to me now. You have coaches who are just starting out and charging $500 an hour to talk to another coach. Like, there's no big secret here. We're trying to share because we're athletes first. Whatever it takes to make the athletes better should be our number one objective. Now, yes, we do have to live. We've got to support our families. Completely get that. And I think seeing, oh God, I can't think. My brain has gone dead. But seeing one of the collegiate strength coaches making $1 million is huge for the industry, because it just shows, it sets the bar to how important strength conditioning is. And I can assure you that person is earning their money. If there's a lot of responsibility comes with that. But we should be sharing more data than going, my system is better than yours. Don't talk to that person. Give me $700 for your time. Like, is there people out there that's worth it? Yes. But most of the strength coaches that to me are worth talking to are near retirement or have done, and they're willing to share. So it's a bizarre time there, and that's kind of a little side rant. But
there are plenty of side rants to be had. You said you don't really want to, disparage anyone in particular. I don't either. But we've both seen the heads of various programs do really, really old ideas. Like, they don't have players squatting. They don't, like, let's say a basketball player. Maybe they're scared to hurt the knees or whatever. Like, just stuff that doesn't make sense. And we know that it doesn't make sense, but that's still what they're sticking to. So we could get on a lot of side rants of all of that. Instead, let's say, check out the conjugate method, and you'll see very quickly that it is very research-based, it's very informative, and it makes sense, and it works. So,
yeah, check it out, and check out every other method too. One thing that many things that Louie taught me was, when you read a book, read 2 more books and then revisit it. See if it still makes sense and if it's still as important to you, because someone can read a book, follow it to a T, and that's it. But read 2 other books that are different and come back to it. Does it still make sense? Because why are these incredibly important figures in the world of strength conditioning? Yuri Verkhoshansky, Zatsiorski, Kurz, they all have their own books that write about different things. So there's a reason. And it's your job is to mold them in together. Because these are very, very smart people who had systems that had huge effects to what we do. But why is there differences between them? Because there's different ways to train. And it's your job is to get every resource possible, make it your own system for the betterment of your athletes.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a few kind of like rapid fire questions. They're going to jump around a little bit. So first, what is the most impressive lift, or I guess lifts, there could be a couple, the most impressive lift you've ever seen at Westside?
Burley Hawk doing an 860 good morning for a triple. That's number one. Number two is Chris Spiegel taking a 630 raw bench, having it fall, catching on his neck, and JM pressing it up.
Wow.
Now, it didn't fall out, but it just came down and went out of position. Those two things are where I looked over at Lou to see, did he see what I just saw? So those are two. And then Hoff, just seeing what he did at meets just blew my mind. I've got, like, the more I think, there's a lot. One thing with Hoff was when he came in one morning to train with the other guys, it was like when he squatted, it was in fast forward and everyone else is in slow motion, just to show the difference at that time. But yeah, those are things that come to my head.
That's one thing that people probably wouldn't necessarily believe. If there's a guy who can squat whatever he's done now, close to 1,300, I think, but you wouldn't necessarily think that, on a really light weight, he's going to be incredibly fast. But I think as a testament to the conjugate method, he is very fast. But I kind of thought you were going to... Go ahead.
Sorry. No,
I kind of thought you were going to mention something with Burley Hawk, because I've seen him do some unconventional lifts in extremely impressive ways. The good mornings. I think there was him and a power lifter, a strongman could have been from Ireland, who came in and they were doing overhead pressing.
Pete.
And it was just, I don't know how heavy they went, but it was incredible to see how quickly they were moving, 300-400 plus pounds overhead.
I'll tell a real quick story just to show the diversity of Burley. I will never talk in his behalf or anything. He's his own unique character and an unbelievable coach too. Burley did Muay Thai and he said he could kick head height. I'm like, there's no way. So obviously anyone who knows me in here, I run my mouth a whole lot, more than I should, but I do. So I'm like, okay, do it. So I get some pads to hold. And I'm waiting for a low blow. I'm just know he's going to kick my legs out. This is going to happen, 100% sure. never came, and he kicked head height so hard that pretty much nearly knocked me out from receiving the impact of that. So the level of athleticism that Burley has is off the charts, and then you're only seeing a little bit through the content he puts out. And his athleticism is only second to him as a coach. I keep going back. He is a phenomenal coach. He trains a bunch of grapplers and lifters, but yeah, he's a unique individual.
Well, it's got to be tough because you've seen, I don't know, millions of lifts at this point, but to pick out, a few impressive ones, that's cool. Let me ask then, so kind of these rapid fire questions, what for golf or for long drive, for a list of special exercises, would you still do things like, skull crushers, lat pull downs, things like that, as a special exercise, or would that take slightly like a different role? Would you put them in a different category and then add in more golf specific stuff for those?
I would start general and then become more specific based on your needs. For everyone, I would, the universal exercise to start with is sleds, upper and lower. That'll carry over, and then as everything evolves, become more specific. Okay.
As far as fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, I've read a lot of, kind of strong opinions, and some people will say, like, if you have a slower twitch predisposition, you're probably always going to be stuck that way, but maybe you've trained into that. So what do you think? Can you train to accentuate the fast twitch fibers? Can you convert muscle fiber types? How does that work?
So you have what you have, and I'm going to train you to be faster compared to yourself. So if you're slow twitch, fast twitch, whatever you have, we have pre and post. I'm not going to compare you to standards. I'm going to compare you to your standard. And then when it comes into the nitty gritty, that is definitely a question for an exercise physiologist. I think, if I remember reading correctly, Dr. Andy Galpin has some pretty good research on this. But to me, it doesn't matter because I'm comparing you to when you started, not everyone else.
Mm-hmm. That's a good answer. So what is Westside doing now, and what's kind of on the forefront of what you guys are looking at?
So we are going headfirst into the plans that Louie laid out before he passed away. So we're pretty involved in that. Come September, we're starting back up our internships, which is a big thing he wanted. And then I think by the end or the middle of August, we will be putting out athlete applications to come train here for no charge, to get more data in and to start showing people how we train every other demographic outside of powerlifters. That's what Louie wanted us to do, and that's what we're going to do.
Part of the image that a lot of people have of Westside is what they have read in the books, have seen in YouTube videos, and then also the documentary that came out that does paint an extremely intense and aggressive nature to Westside. Is that more on the powerlifting side? Is that in everything? Do you not feel like that's really representative of where you guys are now?
To me, the true Westside culture was a time that we were never a part of. We benefit from it. I think if you see that podcast with Chuck Vogenpol, Mark Smarnelli, Dominic Bertolo, and Tom Waddle, those guys are part of the embodiment of that maximal Westside culture and where everything stemmed from. All we can do is pay homage to it and take everything we do seriously as you walk in the door. You're held to a standard. You're representing a culture. Can we replicate that? No, but we can do our damn best. But it's an evolved aspect from it, and I take what they did as the extreme level, and that shows the level of commitment they're willing to have. And if I can try live up to 50% of that, and our athletes can do that, we'll be doing better than most.
That's a good answer. So for people listening who want to try out the conjugate method, who want to learn more, what do you suggest for people on how to get started? Westside-barbell.com. We have a bunch of blogs and articles for free.
just Googling it, there is videos out there from Jordan Sayat did a really good article when he was here, entry level into the Westside or into the conjugate system. But just Google it, read, compare everyone's version, and then obviously the gold standard for us is what Louie put out and the textbooks he suggests.
For sure. So on that note, everybody check out westside-barbell.com. You post a lot on Instagram, YouTube.
Yep, we got a solid team here that it's not just me. I'm just a cog in the works of everything that Louie put down, but we got a really good team, really good, like Burley's on board, Laura works with us, Jason Gussick, Harold runs the business. We're pretty accessible, and we try to put out as much stuff as we can. So, yep, come check it out. I'm not really the best self-promoter. So.
Well, every time that you and I talk, I think the conversation goes on longer than I expect, and I always have more questions I want to ask later. But I think let's wrap it up for now, and I really, really appreciate your time, as always. Thank you, and I'm sure everybody who listens will benefit from learning and gathering some of the information you've gotten over the years.
Awesome. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks, Tom.